Hello there, whoever you are out there. I'm sat in my van atop a mountain, in the rain, in Wales, in the land of the dragons, and I had something I wish to share with you. Something which in part follows on from my talk, How to Win Your Freedom. It is, I might say, for a little bit of fun, a secret. I have kept something which changed my life in many ways 2 or 3 years ago and brought me a great deal of solace and meaning where it was felt terribly lacking. I'm going to begin this talk by laying out a very serious problem I think many of us are sensing has taken hold in our society in the West following the death of religion and the void left in its wake, in the wake of that collapse of belief and moral structure, the meaning. So yes, get yourself a cup of tea. This is going to be deep and hopefully interesting. So without further ado, I'll leave you with my past self. It struck me recently, I think we've all seen, we're all aware, or a lot of us are aware, that in the shift from a uniting organised religion in Britain, it was until recently Christianity in its various denominations, but it was generally we had this Christian moral construct which had many arms, and yes, there was good and there was bad to it, but I think we've all become aware that in our shift towards purely what we consider but is often fails to be purely rational thinking, we've also lost quite a lot. We've lost a unifying moral structure. In relation to politics, for example, religion imposed, you might say, for better or worse, but it imposed a moral authority above the state, above government. And from as I understand it, it's considered, and there's different takes on it, but generally speaking, as I understand it, for example, in a totalitarian regime like in communist Russia, for example, or China, one of the first things they do is destroy religion in order to take away that authority above the government. And so then the government becomes the highest authority. Then the politicians, they don't have to answer to any higher moral standard. They become the absolute arbiters of truth, and to generally disastrous effect. Also in there is this, I think we've all seen it, is with, though there are good things with it, obviously less religious dogma, that politicised power that is organised religion on one side, we free ourselves from that, but we also have lost a lot of meaning. And so in losing that spiritual belief, I think we can probably all agree there's a lot of people out there who feel a great void of meaning, and can very easily, in that void of a united moral structure, that can very easily fall into nihilism. I remember actually experiencing that very keenly myself in my 20s at one particular point. I had this belief, some kind of, I don't think I ever really defined it, but in some overarching force in the universe. And there was a point where that belief collapsed for me. And I remember it being a very dark time in ways. It suddenly collapsed in my mind after I'd been through this long journey seeking this kind of on this trail, on a search for this elusive thing called enlightenment or something. And they eventually led me through, and I built this whole kind of ivory tower around it, and suddenly it all just collapsed and I was left in this void. And in there came this kind of horrendous realization that if I didn't believe in that force, in that God, then there was no right and wrong. Sort of chaos theory. In that state, I felt I could never be sure what was really right and wrong, what was creative and what was destructive, because I didn't know if I did something I thought was good, whether it could have terrible effects in the future, how that would elaborate, what the ramifications would be of my choices. I couldn't predict them, I realised, or I felt at the time I couldn't. And so it led me luckily for a short period, but it led me towards this very nihilistic, quite dark view of reality. It was very disturbing in ways, but I think important to look at in a way, to face that. Point being is that I think we have seen that there is, yes, a lack of meaning emerges in that. If we think everything is pure chance, there is no overriding universal force, whether it be love or an idea of God, whatever. We've got this landscape where nothing really matters. And that, I think we can probably all agree, is a pretty destructive place to reside. If nothing really matters, we're basically one step away from psychopathy, from becoming a psychopath. Because, and I think maybe a lot of us, I have personally experienced that in my life, that idea that, and it's quite a contemporary, the postmodern mindset, that everything is purely a social construct. This is very, very entwined with communism as well, interestingly, where they refuse any religion. Everything is a pure social construct, and therefore one person's account of events, one person's account of truth, that phrase that sums it up often is my lived experience, all of that stuff, that's as good as another's. So there is no hierarchy defining what is good and what is bad. And in that state, I think what we see happening when people fall into that, and I say fall because what it means is they can act very, very badly and abusively, and then they can just say, well, if I'm fine with it, if I feel fine in myself, if I persuade myself that's okay, there is no problem. And if the person who's been harmed by me still has a problem, that's their problem. They just need to work and create some figment in their mind that says they're okay. It's not my responsibility if they perceive themselves having been harmed. It's a very dark, to my eye, a very dark triad that starts appearing there in that way of thinking. Yes. So, we have then, what I'm trying to paint there is this: we've left religion, we've taken up this rational idea of science and there being no God, but we've found ourselves in this limbo where we have no real uniting structure of belief, nothing to define what's good and bad, right and wrong, no real meaning, no grounding. In my personal life, over the last few years, began really developing my interest in history and our ancestors. And I found that an incredibly fulfilling journey. And one of the core things in there is, through that study of history, it's taught me something which I see being terribly absent in our society often. And that is an appreciation for what we've built and those who have built it, and not taking it for granted. There are so many out there who seem very keen to destroy existing civilization, who are basically praying for it to collapse. And I think they're very, very naive. Because anybody who's actually been in a country that's gone through a collapse like that, a real revolution, they will speak of terrible bloodshed and atrocities happening when law collapses. They don't go and suddenly live free and in peace in the woods. They start killing each other when there is no law and order, when there is no moral structure. When all that collapses, chaos ensues. It's not a pretty picture. So for me, I think, yes, that's not something I want to see happen. We definitely have our problems, but I would rather the problems we have at the minute than a complete wasteland of every man for himself. I think, we can all agree there would be some dark things would begin happening there. There's no one to call if someone decides they're going to come and take your property, take your house, or if you're in the way. There's nothing to stop them. It all becomes might is right. There are no rights in that place. So in looking into history and into the ancestors and finding myself developing a real appreciation of what they actually built and what they left in my many films around dolmens. That's one of the early structures we built. And when I look at it, I see a monument to the creative force of people. And I see, whether they actually meant it or not, the fact is that those people 5,500 years ago or so, when they built those dolmens, those monuments, likewise things like stone circles, the pyramids of Egypt, all of these things, these incredible monuments, they still stand here on the land to inspire us. They're still present. So we can look upon them and know that they were here and be inspired by what they managed to achieve. Even if we're not even really sure what it represents, it clearly does represent, at least, and it's also why I get quite irritated personally about people who attribute these things to aliens and things, because I think that denies. It seeks actually to subvert the reality that the humans were that we are amazing creatures ourselves, and that we built that. And so in looking into that past, in looking into that world, what I really drew from it was suddenly connecting to that legacy and knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was part of it. And in seeing what the ancients had done, what my ancestors had done, or direct or indirect, in looking upon their work, it asks the onlooker, stand in front of a dolmen. It asks the onlooker, quite forcefully, what are you going to leave for the next generation, kiddo? What are you doing that's going to stand the test of time? What are you doing that's going to elevate, to inspire, to motivate future generations, those who come after you? What are you doing? But you personally, it's the important thing. Not start thinking in terms of the world. We can very quickly start feeling, well, nothing really matters because I'm just one person amongst nearly 8 billion, whatever. But those structures, they were made by little groups, little communities, and it asks, I think, quite powerfully, in looking at that history, what is the history you are creating for the future? And will it inspire? Will it have a positive influence or a negative influence? And so I wish to suggest that in this idea of ancestor veneration, perhaps what religion originally evolved out of, perhaps what the early gods, at least in the polytheist structures, perhaps what those gods initially were, figureheads of founding members of their culture that were venerated, heroes of the past, etc., that were venerated and slowly evolved a immortal stature. Began as mortal men and women, people who stories were told about, and they slowly took on this immortal stature in the stories being told about them and repeated and evolving, in the legends and the myths about their deeds, in the legends and the myths about the creations of their cultures, perhaps. They evolved into what became gods, I think. Now, many would say that is absolute heresy, but I think that, personally, I think that is the most likely origins. In other words, it was actually a rational, practical system of belief. They were telling stories, I think, about history. And no, it wasn't exact, but they were telling stories which connected those living to those people who had built what they then enjoyed. So they didn't take it for granted. So they felt a duty of care. Now, I feel that in looking upon the dolmen, I found that duty of care impressed upon me from my interest in history. It implies a duty of care once you appreciate what they've built, which many would have us damn. But I think they fail to see the obvious. But that history, to me, it implies this duty of care. And so to me, in this debate that we see, this religion versus atheism, in the void that has grown, to me, I think that there is actually an alternative which gives the best of both worlds. And that is, and I mean it in a loose terms, veneration of the ancestors. And I do not mean going out and worshipping them. I mean just learning about them and appreciating that history by venerating. Developing a reverence for what has come before, for the good things they did, for the inspiration, something like the Pyramid of Giza, for that astonishing inspiration. And whether it was built by slaves or not, good or bad, it's undeniable that it actually inspires us all in a way. And it's exactly why I think it's important not to start creeping into saying aliens built it and stuff. It's an astonishing testament to human creative force, to my eye, however they did it. And that's something not to deny ourselves. And so in that reverence, I'll say, rather than veneration, because it sounds a little too much like worship, but in that reverence of the ancestors, of the people in history, in an appreciation of that journey from our primeval origins through the crafting of metals, all that innovation, all that work, all that effort, in appreciating that, in that suggestion, that implication of our duty to care, to protect that, to build upon it, to not destroy it. In that, I see, in ways, that moral authority, that moral framework, that grounding, that unifying sense of something greater than oneself, which religion offered. I see that offered by a veneration of the ancestors. And in fact, I think people are already turning in that direction, and it's not really understood, or it hasn't been noticed. But I think that's what's actually happening. There was a little sort of comedic meme a few weeks ago that most men think about the Roman Empire, whatever it was, once a day or something like that. I don't personally think about it a lot. I don't find it very interesting, but I definitely think about history daily. And we can see, if we look online, spanning right from this deep interest in archaeology, it's huge, on television and also on online. There's a huge interest in history. And it spans right from the very academic right through to the more philosophical end, where you get Graham Hancock and these things. But there's a huge body there, a huge force, a trend of deep interest in history. And I wonder if what we're actually seeing there, if what that actually represents, is in having lost the meaning that religious belief in Britain that Christianity gave us, which is in itself a history, and is actually, in many accounts, stories of our ancestors. Our ancestors, one way or another, curiously. And perhaps came originally from reverence, from veneration of the ancestors' rituals and beliefs there, and stories. Well, in the lack of that, in the destruction of that, in having lost that, in that void that we've found ourselves left in, I wonder if this huge draw towards history, what it actually is we're returning to that alternative, to the veneration of the ancestors, and the meaning and the connection and the grounding and the moral structure that implies, namely this duty of care to protect and to serve, to project something of value into the future, whether everything is chance or not, whether there is God or not. Do as your ancestors did and give something of value to the future. Create. Respect the creative force of man. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you've got misgivings about civilization, remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, etc. Personally speaking, that has brought a huge amount of meaning to my life. It's filled that void, and it's rational. There is no belief required. It's learning, it's study, it's appreciation. It's a never-ending source of learning and creative potential there. And for me, it's really instilled in me, particularly with my artworks. It's actually what you're looking at on my YouTube channel in many ways. It's having looked upon that, I went away and thought, right, well, I've got to build something. I want to project something good into the future. I want to join those ancestors. I want to be a worthy ancestor to those coming afterwards. And also, as a little aside, for me, I don't have any children. It was a regret of mine. But there's many, many people out there who are in the same position of me, who have, because of this modern world we've come into, they've not been able to have a family. And in seeing that, in looking upon that legacy and connecting myself to it, it made me realise there that actually I can project something of value into the future for the following generations, even if they're not my children. It makes, in that image of that legacy, of that mighty legacy of humanity, in appreciating that and feeling one is part of that, in that way, I can view, in a way, everybody who comes after me as I can view them with the duty of care to a degree that I would bestow on my children. That desperate desire to support, to teach, to impart what one has learned, one's knowledge, that which can, I think, in those who longed for children and never had them, can be a crucifying force, a crucifying lack of somebody to impart what you know to support. Well, for me, in that connection, that reverence of the ancestors, in the connection that has granted me, that tells me, well, take that duty of care, take that and project it into the future for everybody out there coming. Make something beautiful, create something useful, create something inspiring that will bring some solace, some wonder, some inspiration, some motivation for somebody out there in that future who stumbles upon it. And perhaps, you never know, but perhaps it might just save somebody's life in that future. Somebody out there who's feeling lost and depressed would stumble upon something you've created. And it might just be that little drop in the ocean that puts a spring back in their step and reminds them of their own creative potential. Yes. So, consider veneration of the ancestors. It can ground us, and that veneration can be that moral authority. No belief required. This has been Jess Watson. Whoever you are listening, I hope you found that interesting. I hope it gives you something to muse over. As always, I'll be very interested to hear any thoughts you have on that in the comments below. Please try and keep them respectful. Try not to bow to that lowest common denominator. Try to embody the best. Try and project that into the world around you. Aye, that's what I reckon. That's what I'm trying to do. Aye. All the best. Stay dangerous, folks. Cheerio. Bye.
But for the most part, they live in complete isolation. Quite unaware